Do you think you know history? Are you certain that school textbooks, documentaries, and thousands of retellings have given you the truth? Welcome to the archive that stores what people prefer to keep silent about. Each page here smells of the dust of forgotten manuscripts and the bitterness of debunked legends. Here the truth is more terrifying than any fiction, and more beautiful than any fairy tale. If you are ready to learn the truth about myths that were believed for centuries, support this series with a like, and write in the comments which exposé shocked you the most. That will inspire us to open new archives. Myth number 1. The Great Wall of China that no one saw from space. For centuries, it sounded like an axiom, an incontrovertible fact repeated by geography teachers, encyclopedia writers, and tour guides around the world. The Great Wall of China is so vast, so monumental, that it can be seen from space with the naked eye. The phrase became a symbol of human grandeur, proof that mortals can build something truly titanic. Millions of school children memorized this fact like the multiplication table, without doubt, without questions. But imagine the silence that fell in the orbital cabin when the Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei in 2003 candidly admitted. He looked down at his homeland and did not see the wall. At all. Not a strip, not a shadow, not a hint. The person who ought to have been proudest of this spectacle returned and spoke the truth, and that truth ground the pretty myth to dust. Physics is merciless. The wall's width is from 4 to 8 meters. From an orbital height of 350 kilometers, distinguishing an object of that width is like trying to spot a human hair from 2 kilometers away. NASA astronauts confirmed, even with binoculars, even in perfect weather, the wall merges with the mountain terrain and vanishes. What is clearly visible are large reservoirs, wide highways, and cities. Where did the myth come from? The idea was first suggested by the British antiquarian William Stukeley in the 17th century, long before the age of spaceflight, in a purely speculative way. 19th century journalists, fond of striking images, then picked it up. By the 20th century, the legend had rooted so deeply that it found its way into textbooks as an established fact, even though it could not be verified then. The real story of the wall is far more interesting than any myth. It was not built as a single continuous structure, but was erected in sections over almost 2,000 years by different dynasties. Some stretches long ago crumbled to dust, others were rebuilt in the 20th century specifically for tourists. The wall is not a monolith of pride, but a living organism of stone, clay, and human labor that was revered even during its builders' lifetimes. Yet the myth proves stronger than stone. Even today, when the refutation is available to anyone who types a query into a search engine, the phrase "about space" continues to pass from mouth to mouth, because people need symbols of greatness, because the truth is duller than a beautiful lie. Because we all, to some extent, prefer legend to reality. This myth sprang from admiration and a wish to extol human genius, but the next one comes from a much darker source, from political calculation and cold manipulation of an entire people, and its story is no less gripping. Myth number 2, Marie Antoinette and the pastries that never were. Paris, the 78th year of the 18th century. The city is choking on hunger. Bakeries are empty. Lines for bread stretch for whole blocks. Children cry from hunger in the dank archways. And at that very moment, according to the legend, the young Queen of France, reclining in the gilded halls of Versailles, utters her immortal line, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake." Those words became a verdict, a symbol of royal indifference, an icon of aristocratic cruelty. In every history textbook about the French Revolution, that quote stands apart, as proof of how far the authorities were from the people. Actresses playing Marie Antoinette deliver it with a cold smile. Cartoonists drew the queen holding a pastry against the backdrop of a starving crowd. The myth became so organically woven into the revolutionary narrative that it seemed incontrovertible. But historians long ago found an inconvenient detail. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said that. The phrase first appears in the memoirs of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, written when the future queen was only 10 years old and still living in Vienna. Rousseau attributed the words to some unnamed great princess, and the context was another time and place. Later, in the heat of the revolution, pamphleteers seized the line and put it into the queen's mouth, the perfect enemy of the people. The real Marie Antoinette was more complicated and more human than her caricature. She donated personal funds to charity, personally fed the poor during harsh winters, and her letters are full of anxiety about France's fate. She was a young woman thrust into a foreign country at the age of 14, taught to smile where she wanted to weep. The pastry myth survived precisely because revolutions need villains. Popular rage requires a face, beautiful, cold, indifferent. The truth about a complex person can never replace an ideal symbol. And that lesson has not grown outdated. This myth killed a living person by replacing her with a convenient icon. But the next one resurrected a non-existent hero and made whole generations worship him. Myth number 3. Albert Einstein, the failing pupil who discovered the universe. This tale reads like the perfect motivational speech for every struggling schoolchild. The greatest physicist of all time, the man who overturned humanity's notions of space and time, in childhood, he was a failure. Teachers wrote complaints about him. School grades suggested utter hopelessness. And from that loser, a genius grew, whose name has become synonymous with intelligence. A story that tightens the chest. A story recounted by parents to children, teachers to pupils, coaches to clients. Only it is not true. Not at all. Albert Einstein was an outstanding pupil. In the Swiss grading system in which he was educated, the highest mark was 6, and it was 6s that adorned his certificate in mathematics and physics. He had mastered differential calculus at 15. His teachers recorded exceptional talent. There was no failure, no academic disaster. So where did the myth come from? From a mix-up between grading systems. When American journalists in the 20th century examined his Swiss papers, they saw the figure 1 and assumed it corresponded to the American one, that is, a failing grade. In the old Swiss scale, 1 was actually the top mark. The journalists inverted the poles of the scale, and the legend was born. The real Einstein story is far more interesting than the failing student myth. He did indeed fail the entrance examination to the Zurich Polytechnic, but only because he applied 2 years earlier than the proper age and did not pass the humanities portion, where he was weak. In physics and mathematics, his scores were remarkable. He was a prodigy with an uneven profile, a mind that outpaced the system rather than lagged behind it. The myth of the failing pupil persists because it is convenient. It promises, no matter how you study, you can still become great. It is a consoling falsehood that relieves us of the duty to work. The truth demands more. Work, immerse yourself, do not wait to be noticed. This myth was born of the desire to comfort. The next one arises from a desire to frighten, and behind it lies one of the bleakest chapters in medical history. Myth number 4. Operations without anesthesia, because it did not exist. The image that haunts the imagination, a 19th century surgeon with a saw in his hand, a patient lashed to the table, assistants holding his shoulders, and all of it without a single drop of painkiller. Historians, writers, and filmmakers have fashioned this picture into an icon of suffering. We were told, until the discovery of ether anesthesia in 1846, doctors were forced to operate on the living, and patients endured inhuman agony or died of shock. A surgeon's speed was measured not by skill, but by mercy. The faster, the less torture. That is true, but only part of the truth. The part that conceals a far more complex and surprising reality. People did not wait for 1846. They sought pain relief for millennia, and they found it. In ancient Egypt, surgeons used mixtures based on mandrake, opium, and alcohol. Indian physicians several centuries before our era employed preparations from the plant sarpaganda with sedative effects. Medieval European surgeons made the so-called sleeping sponge, a cloth soaked in tinctures of opium, mandrake, henbane, and hemlock. The patient inhaled the vapors and lost consciousness. The method was imperfect and hazardous, but it existed. The Incas in South America practiced trepanation, a highly complex operation, using coca leaves chewed by both patient and surgeon, the latter even spitting saliva into the surgical wound for local numbing. The survival rate, as shown by skulls with healed trepanation openings, was surprisingly high. The myth of a complete lack of anesthesia grew out of a different error, a Eurocentric reading of medical history that dismissed everything before the Western scientific revolution as primitive or non-existent. Suffering became the dominant narrative because suffering makes for drama. Yet people have always sought ways to avoid pain, and they found them, imperfect though they were. That truth does not erase the horrors of pre-reform surgery, but it tells us something important. Humanity never accepted pain as inevitable. It has always fought against it. This myth impoverished our picture of the past, portraying ancestors as helpless. The next myth, by contrast, endowed them with superhuman virtues they never possessed. Myth number 5. Knights in shining armor and the noble code of honor. The medieval knight in gleaming plate, faithful to his word, defender of the weak, champion of justice, ready to die for his lady and the honor of his suzerain. This image saturates Western culture, from medieval romances to Hollywood blockbusters. Chivalry is presented as a golden age of nobility, when war still followed rules and warriors had consciences. But behind the polished visor lay something very different. Let us begin with the armor. Shining plate did not appear until the late Middle Ages and belonged to a vanishingly small minority. Most knights spent most of their time in mail, stained with sweat, rust, and dried blood, with no one and no reason to keep it polished in the constant grind of campaigning. The real knightly camp would have smelled intolerable to us. The code of honor was a code for equals. Knightly rules of conduct in war applied only to other knights, and noble prisoners worth ransoms. Peasants, infantry, and townspeople were outside that code. Chronicles are full of accounts of knightly armies systematically pillaging villages, driving off livestock, and burning crops, practices known as chevauche and recognized as legitimate military tactics. The aim was to deprive an enemy of resources by devastating the civilian population of his lands. A real knight was above all an investment. A mount, armor, and weapons required upkeep and huge expense. Knights fought for booty, ransom from noble captives, and land grants. Nobility was rhetoric. Economics was the reality. Courtly love and the protection of ladies? Medieval texts about courtly love were produced at courts as literary games for the aristocracy, not as manuals of everyday conduct. A woman's actual status in feudal society was governed not by knightly romance but by property law, in which she was treated as property, first of her father, then of her husband. The myth of chivalry was deliberately constructed, and not in the Middle Ages, but in the 19th century, during the Romantic era. It was then that writers, poets, and artists reimagined the Middle Ages as an age of lost nobility, a counter-narrative to the soulless industrial present. They invented a myth because they needed one. This myth longed for a past that never existed. The next one claimed credit for other people's achievements, and behind it lies a story of grand scientific theft. Myth number 6. Newton discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head. An apple orchard in Lincolnshire. A young Isaac Newton sits beneath a tree. An apple drops, strikes his head, and at that instant the genius has an epiphany. The law of universal gravitation is born. The tale is so perfectly shaped, so cinematic, that it seems tailor-made for a textbook. The apples blow, and the foundations of science shift. The truth is far messier and far more interesting than that neat picture. First, the apple most likely did not fall on Newton's head. It simply fell nearby. Newton recounted the episode in his old age to different people, and the details shifted each time. His niece Catherine Conduit recorded a version in which the apple merely dropped from the tree while the scientist was pondering in the garden, with no impact. The philosopher Voltaire, having heard the story from the same Catherine, added theatrical flourish. Later retellings refined the image into an icon. Second, and this is the key point, Newton did not discover gravity as a phenomenon. People have always known that objects fall downward. Long before Newton, The Italian scholar Giovanni Battista Riccioli studied falling bodies systematically. Galileo established the mathematical groundwork. Robert Hooke, Newton's close colleague and rival, developed the concept of attraction between bodies and even corresponded with Newton on the subject. What Newton actually did was construct the mathematical framework that allowed gravity to be described universally. Both the falling apple and the moon's motion obeyed a single law. That was a monumental intellectual leap. It was not, however, a flash of insight caused by a piece of fruit. The apple story served Newton himself, an aging man showered with honors but still embroiled in bitter priority disputes. A handsome legend of a lone genius in a garden cut out competitors and collaborators. Science does not arise in isolation, yet we prefer to believe that it does. This myth romanticized science. The next one devalued an entire civilization that in reality was its cradle. Myth number 7. The Dark Ages were dark. Dark Ages. The very phrase sounds like a verdict. The period from the 5th to the 10th century of European history, after the fall of the Roman Empire, is presented as an interval in which humanity supposedly sank into ignorance, superstition, and barbarism. No books, no science, no philosophy. Only plague, war, and obscurantism. That is how we were taught. That is how we believed. This is one of the most unfair myths in the history of historiography. Begin with the fact that the term Dark Ages is a Renaissance invention. 15th and 16th century Italian humanists, enamored of antiquity, coined the idea of a dark stretch between the Great Roman era and the Great Renaissance. It was a rhetorical device, not a historical description. They called the centuries dark because their libraries contained few sources from that era, not because sources did not exist, but because they had not yet been discovered and translated. While Western Europe was going through a truly difficult stretch after the fall of Rome, intellectual life was flourishing elsewhere on other continents and even in other parts of Europe. The Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th through the 13th centuries, gave humanity algebra, optics, astronomy, and medicine. The Byzantine Empire preserved and recopied Greek manuscripts. Irish monasteries served as centers of learning, drawing manuscripts from across Europe. Western Europe itself was erecting cathedrals that required the most complex engineering calculations, developing Romanesque and Gothic arts, creating legal systems, trade networks, and agricultural technologies. Medieval monks in their scriptoria did more than copy texts. They annotated, debated, and organized knowledge. Dark is a description of our archives, not of the era. When sources are scarce, we label a period dark because we cannot see it. The darkness was in our eyes, not in the centuries. This myth obscured an entire age. The next one, dazzlingly, spotlighted a single person, turning a genuine tragedy into a triumph. Myth number 8. Cleopatra was Egyptian. Cleopatra. The name alone conjures an image, a dusky beauty on a golden throne, eyes rimmed in black, wearing a nemes and a uraeus. The embodiment of Egypt, daughter of pharaohs, heiress to a millennia-old Nile civilization. That is how painters, films, and historical novels have portrayed her. Elizabeth Taylor, with dark hair and Egyptian makeup, became the eternal icon of that image. But Cleopatra was a Macedonian Greek. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by the commander of Alexander the Great, Ptolemy I, after the conqueror's death. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, yet they remained Greek in language, culture, and blood. They guarded their lineage so zealously that they practiced sibling marriage, as Egyptian pharaohs had done before them, but for very different reasons. Most of them saw no need to learn the Egyptian tongue. Cleopatra was the exception, and that is what truly set her apart. She became the first Ptolemy to learn Egyptian. According to ancient authors, she spoke 9 languages, including Ethiopian, Arabic, Parthian, and Hebrew. She was a political genius with extraordinary linguistic talents. It was this, not some mythical beauty, that made her a striking diplomat and ruler. Plutarch, who wrote of her unsurpassed charm, himself explained that it lay not in her looks but in her intellect and speech. Her voice, he said, was like a many-stringed instrument. She captivated by word, not by face. The myth of an Egyptian Cleopatra is a myth of belonging. We want Egypt to belong to Egypt, but history is rarely that tidy. This myth appropriated a person. Next, an entire invention was claimed by someone else, and the perpetrator of that theft turned out to be one of the most respected figures in history. Myth number 9. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. The 10th day of March, 1876, is celebrated as the birthday of the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell spoke the first words ever heard over a telephone line, and addressed to his assistant Watson. The tale is neat, precise, and documented. Bell received a patent, founded a company, and entered the textbooks. But the patent had been filed just hours earlier than an application presented to the same registrar by another inventor, Elisha Gray. This is not speculation. It is a documented fact that became the subject of one of the most prolonged patent disputes in American history. Elisha Gray, a gifted inventor and the founder of the firm that later became Western Electric, arrived at the patent office on the same day as Bell. By various accounts, he was late by a period ranging from several hours to several minutes, depending on which version of the official records one accepts. Yet there was another figure, the Italian inventor Antonio Meucci. As early as 1849, in Havana, he built a voice communication apparatus he called the teletrafono. In 1871, he filed a preliminary patent notice, a caveat, for his invention. He could not afford to pay for a full patent. Meucci was poor, his wife was ill, and money was lacking. The caveat lapsed. In 1876, Bell obtained the patent. In 2002, the United States Congress officially acknowledged Meucci's priority in inventing the telephone. That declaration did not change the textbooks. The history of the telephone is a story about how poverty erases authorship. The invention belongs to the person who can pay for it. This myth rested on paperwork and bureaucracy. The next one is built around the flames of a real pyre and the birth of a scientific martyr. Myth number 10. Giordano Bruno was burned for heliocentrism. The 17th of February, 1600. The Flower Square in Rome. A bonfire. The Inquisition. A scholar proudly refusing to recant and dying for science. Giordano Bruno became an emblem of the conflict between science and religion, a martyr of heliocentrism, a victim of obscurantism, the first in the roll call of those whom the Church persecuted for scientific truth. This story lies, not entirely, but in its most important part. Bruno was indeed executed, but not for heliocentrism. The records of the inquisitorial proceedings, made partially available to researchers in the 19th century and more fully in the 20th, tell a different story. The principal charges against Bruno were theological heresies. He denied the Trinity, rejected the incarnation of Christ, disputed the Immaculate Conception and the Eucharist, and was involved in magic and occult practices. By that time, the heliocentric model was not officially prohibited. Copernicus died a natural death, and his book had been published without immediate repercussions. Bruno's cosmological ideas appeared in the trial, but they were not the central accusations. He was a convinced heretic in the theological sense, and that belief cost him his life. Bruno was a striking figure, a mystic, a philosopher, a former monk who wandered across Europe without settling anywhere for long and argued with everyone, everywhere. His notion of the universe as infinite and of a multitude of inhabited worlds, far more radical than heliocentrism, was genuinely ahead of its time. Yet, he was executed for blasphemy, not for astronomy. The myth of Bruno the scientist was manufactured in the 19th century by secular thinkers who needed a symbol to oppose clericalism. They took a real martyr and turned him into a different, more convenient martyr. This myth rewrote the motives for his execution. The next one rewrote the motives for victory. And behind it lies the story of the most famous naval battle in the world. Myth number 11. Trafalgar was the triumph of a single genius. The 21st of October, 1805. Cape Trafalgar. Admiral Nelson on the deck of the Victory. His tactical genius breaks the battle line of the Franco-Spanish fleet, and Britain exults. Nelson falls at the moment of victory, and that death turns him into a legend. One man, one battle, history changed. But Nelson's brilliant tactics, on closer inspection, turn out to be far less unique. An attack in 2 columns perpendicular to the enemy line, the so-called breaking the enemy's line, was not Nelson's invention. This tactic appears in the theoretical writings of the Scottish Admiral John Clerk, which were widely read in the Navy. Rodney used it at Dominica in 1782. Nelson knew these precedents and drew on them. What truly won Trafalgar was the quality of the British crews. British gun crews could deliver 3 volleys at a time when French or Spanish crews could manage only 1. British naval officers trained for years under the realities of blockade, while their adversaries were kept in port by French command, which feared losing ships before a decisive engagement. By the time of the battle, Nelson had a highly experienced force facing exhausted and demoralized opponents. Trafalgar's victory was a victory of the system. It was the fruit of long preparation, technical superiority, and combat experience. Nelson was an outstanding commander, but he was not a magician. The myth of the lone genius is convenient because it offers a simple answer. History is never simple. This myth simplified the victory. The next one diminished the defeat, hiding within it a story that alters our entire understanding of a great war. Myth number 12. The First World War began because of the assassination of an archduke. Shots in Sarajevo. The 28th of June, 1914. Gavrilo Princip pulls the trigger. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed. Within weeks, war. The causal link appears obvious. One assassination, and peace collapses. One bullet, and millions perish. This is the most tempting simplification in history. The assassination in Sarajevo was the spark in a powder keg, but the keg had been filled for decades. By 1914, Europe was threaded with networks of military alliances that obliged states to join a war if a partner was attacked. Germany was arming at a menacing pace, alarming France and Russia. Britain jealously defended its naval supremacy. Austria-Hungary sought a pretext to crush Serbian nationalism on its borders. Historians have calculated that by the summer of 1914, the military plans of the European powers had become so rigid and interlocked that one country's mobilization would automatically trigger a chain reaction. The German Schlieffen Plan called for a lightning strike against France through Belgium, and that is what drew Britain into the war, since it guaranteed Belgian neutrality. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. But had it not been him, some other excuse would likely have been found. The crisis of 1914 was merely one in a succession of crises that Europe had repeatedly and miraculously resolved peacefully. This time, it did not work out. The myth of a single shot absolves systems of responsibility. It is systems, military, political, economic, that make wars. People only pull triggers that have already been cocked. That myth reduced the catastrophe to accident. The next one turned a pattern into chance. And that tale is tied to the most famous failure in the history of military intelligence. Myth number 13. Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise to America. The 7th of December, 1941. A day that will live in infamy, Roosevelt would say. Japanese planes over the harbor, battleships burning, total surprise. A sleeping America struck by a treacherous blow. That is how the story entered public memory, as pure betrayal, a sneak attack nobody expected. But Washington knew, not everything, but enough. By the autumn of 1941, American cryptographers had broken Japanese diplomatic codes. Radio interception units were recording exchanges that pointed toward the inevitability of military action. The Japanese ambassador in Washington received orders from Tokyo to sever diplomatic ties and destroy cipher machines, a clear sign of impending war. That message was intercepted and decrypted by American intelligence. The problem was not a lack of information, but its interpretation and circulation. Intelligence agencies operated in isolation and did not share their data. Army and Navy analyses were not coordinated. Intercepts indicated a threat in the Pacific, But most analysts anticipated strikes against Malaya, the Philippines, or the Dutch East Indies, not Hawaii, which was deemed too remote. Warnings did come. Washington sent increasingly urgent telegrams to Hawaii, but bureaucratic procedures, transmission errors, and geographic distance did their work. The final warning arrived in Hawaii only after the attack had begun. This was not a conspiracy or deliberate laxity. It was a systemic failure. But admitting a system failure is harder than believing in malicious intent. The myth of complete surprise removes questions from Washington. The truth about an intelligence failure raises them. This myth concealed a systemic breakdown. The next one hid an individual. And behind that person's mask lies one of the most astonishing spy stories of the 20th century. Myth number 14. Stierlitz, a fictional creation. Max Otto von Stierlitz, an SS colonel, a Soviet intelligence officer who spent 17 years in the enemy's den. The hero of the cult Soviet series 17 mgnień wesny. In the SSSR, he became a popular character, the subject of jokes, a symbol of intellect and coolness. Everyone knows this is a literary fiction, a brilliant construct by Yulian Semyonov. But prototypes of Stierlitz existed, and their stories are stranger than any novel. Willy Lehmann, a Gestapo officer who worked for Soviet intelligence from 1929 to 1942, 13 years in the very heart of the German security services. He passed to Moscow information about the Gestapo structure, the names of agents and operational plans. He was unmasked only when a Soviet defector handed him over to the Germans. Lehmann's fate after arrest is unknown. German archives on his case have never been fully declassified. Rudolf von Scheele, a German diplomat serving in the Polish and Romanian sections of the German Foreign Ministry and passing information to Soviet intelligence. Alexander Rado, a Hungarian geographer who ran the Soviet espionage network Dora in Switzerland during the war years. Soviet intelligence really did have agents in the upper echelons of Nazi Germany. Their stories remain partly classified to this day. Stierlitz is not a single person, and not pure invention. He is a composite figure, woven from real lives of people who lived in deceit and died without recognition. This myth cloaked reality with fiction. The next one hid fiction behind reality. And that story concerns the most famous children's author in history. Myth number 15. Lewis Carroll wrote Alisu for the innocent amusement of children. A golden summer day in 1862, Oxford mathematician Charles Dodgson, also known as Lewis Carroll, is rowing with his colleague's family and tells the children a fantastical story. Little Elisa Little asks him to write it down. The cause of the break is unknown. Pages from Carroll's diary covering that period have also been cut out. Some historians suggest he proposed, either to Elisa, who was 11 years old, or to her older sister. That does not make Alisu v Stranie Cudes a bad book. Literature exists independently of its maker. Yet the image of a kindly dreamer who gave children a fairy tale is a myth. Behind it stands a complex, dark figure still not fully understood. This myth guarded the reputation of a genius. The next one protected the standing of an entire nation and was debunked only a century later. Myth number 16. Paschalny Ostrov was destroyed by its own inhabitants. Stone giants stare into the void. Moai, mysterious colossal statues in the midst of the Pacific Ocean. When Europeans found Paschalny Ostrov in the year 1722, they encountered a tiny community on an island that had apparently once flourished. From that arose a story, a warning to humanity. The islanders had felled all the trees to move the statues, ruined their own ecosystem, and perished in wars over dwindling resources. Ecological suicide, a vivid lesson. This story is false. Start with the trees. Yes, the island's forests were cleared, but recent research, including pollen analysis from sediments and genetic studies of the Polynesian rats brought by the first settlers, shows that the principal force behind forest loss was Polynesian rats, which multiplied unchecked by natural predators. They ate palm seeds faster than they could germinate. People cut trees, but the rats made recovery impossible. As for the civilizational collapse, it did occur, but not when we were told. When Rogetvan arrived in the year 1722, he found a small but stable society, not one in agonizing decline. The real catastrophe came later. European diseases decimated the population. Peruvian slave traders in the year 1862 abducted and sold into slavery about 1,500 people, nearly half of the island's population at the time. The idea of Paschalny Ostrov as an ecological suicide is a political metaphor imposed on a real but different tragedy. The true destroyers of the island were not the Rapa Nui themselves, but those who sailed to their shores. This myth shifted the blame. The next one wrongly redistributed credit, and behind it lies the story of a great invention whose author was eclipsed. Myth number 17. The light bulb was invented by Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, a genius from Menlo Park, 1,000 experiments before the right filament was found. October 21st in the year 1879, the first practical electric light bulb. It is a tale of persistence, genius, and the American dream. Edison changed the world. That is how textbooks tell it. The problem is that the light bulb had been invented before Edison by at least 22 other inventors. A British scientist, Humphrey Davy, invented the electric arc lamp in 1812. Warren de la Rue, in 1841, placed a platinum filament inside a vacuum tube, the principle that underpins the incandescent lamp. The Briton Joseph Swan was granted a patent for a lamp with a carbon filament in 1878, 1 year before Edison. Swan began selling his lamps commercially in Britain earlier than Edison established manufacturing in America. What Edison did was assemble a working system, not merely the bulb, but the entire infrastructure: generators, wires, meters, outlets. He built the first central power station in New York in 1882. It was an engineering and entrepreneurial feat, arguably more consequential than the lamp itself. In the end, Edison was compelled to join forces with Swan. Their joint firm was called Ediswan. Patent battles, marketing savvy, and geographical fortune determined whose name entered the textbooks. This myth about the light bulb is really a myth about how fame operates. It falls not to the earliest inventor, but to the loudest. This myth rewarded the marketer for the engineer's invention. The next one rewarded the victor for another strategy, and that story unfolds at the hottest moment of the 20th century. Myth number 18. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved by Kennedy. October of 1962. The world on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. 13 days of confrontation. Soviet missiles in Cuba. Kennedy looking Khrushchev in the eye, and the latter blinked first. American resolve versus Soviet adventurism. Kennedy saved the world. That is the version Washington promoted for decades. The truth was classified. The crisis was settled not so much by the public blockade of Cuba as by a secret agreement that Kennedy vehemently denied while alive. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States secretly undertook to withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, the very ones aimed at the USSR, within a few months. In addition, the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. It was a mutual retreat. Khrushchev obtained what he wanted: the removal of American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy obtained what he wanted: the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. Neither leader surrendered unconditionally. The deal was kept secret because admitting the compromise publicly would have destroyed the narrative of American victory. Robert Kennedy personally asked the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin to keep the terms confidential. He agreed and remained silent until the 1980s. The world was saved not by the resolve of a single leader, but by the diplomatic flexibility of two, and the anonymity of that flexibility. This myth hid a compromise behind victory. The next one hid defeat behind the myth of an unbowed spirit. And that story concerns a war that never seemed to end. Myth number 19. Hiroshima stopped the war. The 6th of August, 1945. The atomic bomb over Hiroshima. On the 9th of August, over Nagasaki. On the 15th of August, Japan's surrender. The reasoning looks airtight. The bombs broke Japanese will to fight, and saved the millions of lives an invasion of the islands would have cost. This is the official account that is still repeated. Historians pose an awkward question. What if something else stopped Japan? American historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa and other scholars who worked with Japanese, American, and Soviet archives uncovered a striking detail. The Japanese High Command knew about the losses in Hiroshima, but it was not immediately stunned by the mere existence of a new bomb. Tokyo had already endured far more devastating conventional bombing. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in one night than the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. What truly shook the Japanese War Council was the USSR's entry into the war on the 8th of August 1945. Japan had been counting on Soviet mediation to secure an honorable peace. When Soviet forces launched their offensive in Manchuria, that hope collapsed at once. Surrendering to America now seemed preferable to Soviet occupation. That does not mean the atomic bombs were irrelevant, but they may not have been the only or even the principal factor. The story of the bomb that stopped the war is convenient. It justifies the use of nuclear weapons. The more complicated truth leads to different conclusions. That myth vindicated a weapon. The next one vindicated a man, and that man was portrayed as a monster. Myth number 20. Genghis Khan was only a destroyer. Mongol hordes, torched cities, heaps of skulls. Genghis Khan entered history as the personification of destruction, a natural disaster in human form. The Yellow Death, sweeping with fire from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, destroyed, by some estimates, 40 to 60 million people. This image is so deeply rooted that the very word Mongol became synonymous with barbarism. But behind that image lies another, and no less real, side. The Mongol Empire created the longest zone of free trade in pre-modern history. Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, for nearly a century provided relative security along the Great Silk Road from China to the Mediterranean. Merchants could travel from one end of Eurasia to the other under the protection of a unified network of postal stations, YAM, and a single body of law. Genghis Khan introduced religious tolerance to his empire, an astonishing innovation for the 13th century. All religions were officially permitted, and the clergy were exempted from taxes. He forbade torture during interrogations, while most settled civilizations practiced it widely. He created the first writing system in Mongolia by ordering the adaptation of the Uyghur alphabet for the Mongolian language. The destruction was real and horrific, but Genghis Khan was not solely a destroyer. He was a builder of systems that transformed Eurasian trade and cultural exchange for a century. The myth of the pure barbarian is convenient. It frees us from having to think. That legend flattened the villain. The next one complicates the hero. And this is a tale about one of the most revered scientists in history. Myth number 21. Galileo was the first to say that the Earth turns. Galileo Galilei before the Inquisition. The famous line, "And yet it moves." Science versus church. Reason against doctrine. A lone genius defending the heliocentric truth against religious obscurantism. But Galileo was not the first, and the phrase was most likely never spoken by him. Nicholas Copernicus set out a heliocentric system in 543, 70 years before Galileo's trial. Giordano Bruno preached about an infinite universe and many worlds. Tycho Brahe proposed a compromise model in which the planets orbit the Sun while the Sun orbits the Earth. Johannes Kepler had already calculated the elliptical paths of the planets. Galileo was the first to use the telescope systematically for astronomical observation and to obtain concrete evidence, the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter. Those were genuine scientific accomplishments, but he stood among many contributors, not as the solitary figure opposing everyone else. The line, "and yet it moves," appears in the records only 100 years after the alleged utterance, and in circumstances that make its authenticity doubtful. The story that he whispered it after recanting is almost certainly a later legend born of admiration rather than contemporary memory. The real Galileo was complex, proud, and at times harsh toward his adversaries. He was a genius, but one among other geniuses, not in place of them. This myth of the lone genius keeps resurfacing. The next one tells how an entire people supposedly preferred death to dishonor. Myth number 22. Samurai always preferred death to shame. Harakiri, seppuku. A samurai who loses honor slices open his belly. This image has so deeply penetrated Western ideas about Japanese culture that it often becomes the defining trait. The Japanese warrior readily chooses death because honor outweighs life. It is both romantic and horrific, the aesthetics of death as the highest art. The historical reality of seppuku is much more prosaic and politically charged. Ritual suicide occurred in particular periods of Japanese history, but it was never a universal norm. In the Edo period, from the 17th to the 19th century, the shogunate effectively restricted and regulated the practice. A vassal's unilateral suicide could create legal problems for his lord. The ritual became institutionalized, bureaucratized, and to a significant extent was transformed into an official form of execution, more honorable than beheading, but still a legal penalty. Most samurai over the course of Japanese history died in their beds, occupied with administration, teaching, or farming. The samurai class, during the many peaceful stretches, and the peaceful stretches were the majority, led a bureaucratic life far removed from the romanticized image. The image of the samurai who inevitably chose death was formed partly by Japanese cultural texts, especially Hagakure of the 18th century, and partly by Western Orientalism of the 19th and 20th centuries. It served political ends. During the Second World War, the Japanese command actively used this myth to justify the tactics of kamikaze and the insistence on fighting to the last. This myth served war. The next one served peace, but lied about the cost of that peace. Myth number 23. The Berlin Wall fell because of a popular uprising. The 9th of November, 1989. Crowds of Berliners stormed the wall. Picks in hands, tears in eyes, jubilation on faces. The Iron Curtain collapsed. Popular will triumphed. That is how it entered memory, as the masses' victory over the system. But the wall fell because of a bureaucrat's slip of the tongue. Günter Schabowski, press secretary of the Politburo of the GDR, at the evening press conference on the 9th of November, received a note with a new decree. The authorities would permit citizens to apply for exit through any border crossing. The measure was supposed to come into force the next day, after bureaucratic formalities. Schabowski did not manage to read it before the conference. He received the note immediately before going out to the journalists. When asked when the new rule took effect, he flipped through the papers and said, "Immediately, without delay." He did not know he was mistaken. The news went out live. Within an hour, thousands gathered at the border crossings. Border guards, receiving no instructions, phoned their commanders. They knew nothing. In the end, Officer Harald Jäger at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint decided on his own. He raised the barrier to avoid bloodshed. Popular pressure was real. The wall was already living its last months. But the precise moment of its fall was determined by human error. History is made by slips and improvisation as often as by great decisions. This myth turned accident into inevitability. The next one turned inevitability into mystique. And that is a story about a disease people feared to understand for centuries. Myth number 24. The Black Death killed at random. The Plague. The Black Death of the 14th century. In popular imagination, a blind biblical vengeance that struck without distinction at rich and poor, righteous and sinful. 1/3 of Europe. Millions of victims. Terror without logic. Death without warning. Illness without explanation. But medical historians have found that the plague did not kill at random, and there is a remarkable story in that. Studies of burial sites of plague victims in London, Denmark, and Germany revealed something striking. Among the dead, there was a disproportionate number of people who already suffered from other illnesses, malnourishment, and physical injuries before the epidemic. The plague found the weakened. Moreover, DNA analysis from plague graves has shown that some people of that time carried genetic variants that gave their descendants increased resistance to HIV. In other words, the plague imposed evolutionary pressure that altered the genetic makeup of the European population. The social logic of the plague was not accidental either. It killed the poor disproportionately more, because of overcrowding and lack of access to food and medical care. Monks and priests died more often than others, because they were in direct contact with the sick and the dying. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and whole communities were exterminated, while in some places their mortality was lower thanks to the sanitary rules of Jewish law, a fact taken as evidence of a conspiracy. The plague killed according to the laws of biology and the laws of social inequality. It was not blind, but observant, and what it revealed tells us more about medieval society than any textbook. This myth hid the social in the spontaneous. The next one hid the political in the heroic. And that story concerns one of Europe's most cherished national myths. Myth number 25. Jeanne d'Arc was burned by the church as a heretic. May 30th, 1431. Rouen. The stake. The 19-year-old Jeanne d'Arc dies. The church burns a girl who dared to speak directly with God. That is how this myth survives, as a tale of religious fanaticism crushing pure faith. But who financed the trial of Jeanne? The trial of Jeanne d'Arc was financed by the English. They took her captive, having bought her from the Burgundians, and they had a political interest in her elimination. Jeanne fought for the French crown and brought Charles VII to coronation, threatening English claims to the French throne. Her death was needed by them as a political act, and they used an ecclesiastical court as their tool. The clerical judges, headed by the Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, were under direct pressure and funded by the English crown. Cauchon was aligned with the English. After Rouen was retaken by the French, he fled to them. The charges of heresy and witchcraft were manufactured to produce the desired outcome. Notably, in 1456, 25 years after the execution, a church court rehabilitated Jeanne and declared the first trial null and void. This was not a triumph of science over the church, nor of reason over superstition. It was a political execution carried out by foreign hands. In 1920, Jeanne was canonized by the same church that had burned her. Institutions know how to rewrite the past. This myth hid politics behind faith. The next one hid fear behind statistics. And that story unfolds in the heart of modern medicine. Myth number 26. 19th century doctors washed their hands and knew why. Cleanliness stood next to piety. Hand washing now seems such an obvious hygienic requirement that it is hard to believe doctors once fiercely resisted the idea. The story of Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who, in 1847, showed that washing hands with chlorinated lime reduced puerperal mortality from 10% to less than 1%, is usually told as the tale of a lone genius who was ignored, but it is far darker. Semmelweis was not merely unheard. He was rejected by the medical establishment with a ferocity that verged on professional murder. Europe's leading physicians publicly ridiculed him. His data were real and irrefutable. The mortality statistics spoke for themselves. Yet to accept his idea was to concede that it was the doctors, who had moved from performing autopsies to attending births without washing their hands, who were killing their patients. That was unbearable. Not intellectually, but emotionally and professionally. Physicians were gentlemen. Their hands could not be unclean. To admit guilt would have shattered their self-image. Semmelweis gradually unraveled from bitterness and lack of recognition. In 1865, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital, apparently against his will. He died 2 weeks later, under unclear circumstances, possibly of the very infection he had fought his whole life. Pasteur and Lister, who came a little later, were celebrated because they arrived with the germ theory that provided an intellectual framework. Semmelweis had only data. Data alone proved insufficient. The myth of the unrecognized genius is true, but the reality is even darker than the myth. That myth of resistance to knowledge still shocks. The next concerns resistance to forgetting, and this story is tied to one of the most suppressed events of the 20th century. Myth number 27. The Spanish flu came from Spain. The Spanish flu, 1918, the greatest pandemic of the 20th century, which killed, by various estimates, from 50 to 100 million people. The very name implies the disease came from Spain. Or did it? Spain had nothing to do with the origin of that flu. In 1918, the First World War was underway. All belligerent nations, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, imposed strict military censorship. Reports about an illness undermining army effectiveness were not allowed in the press. Such information would have been a gift to the enemy. Spain did not participate in the war. The Spanish press operated freely and reported honestly on the growing epidemic. The world read Spanish accounts of the outbreak and concluded the disease was Spanish. It was an illusion born of a free press in a neutral country set against censorship everywhere else. Where did the virus actually come from? That question remains debated. The most documented early outbreaks are those in American military camps in Kansas in early 1918. Other researchers point to China or Europe, but not Spain. Spain was punished for telling the truth, while everyone else was silent. It was saddled with the disease's name, unjustly, accidentally, and permanently. This myth arose from censorship. The next comes from propaganda, and its debunking concerns one of the most persistent beliefs about the Soviet era. Myth number 28. Soviet cosmonauts never got lost in space. Gagarin, Titov, Tereshkova. The Soviet space program celebrated its successes and kept its failures quiet. The official account of Soviet cosmonautics is a tale of triumphs: the first satellite, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk. There was no acknowledged catastrophic failure until Komarov's death in 1967, but the Giudica Cordelia brothers existed. Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordelia, Italian amateur radio operators from Turin, built their own radio interception setup in the late 1950s and early 1960s and began monitoring Soviet space frequencies. They recorded transmissions that they believed indicated several Soviet space flights ended in disaster, before Gagarin's officially announced first flight. Among their tapes is an alleged radio exchange with a dying cosmonaut whose craft was re-entering the atmosphere improperly. The Soviet side never officially recognized those recordings, nor produced documents to refute them. Declassified post-Soviet archives did not corroborate most of the brothers' specific claims. They did, however, confirm something else. The Soviet program did conceal accidents and the deaths of test personnel. The names of those who died during ground tests and in unrecovered suborbital flights were classified for decades. Soviet space was not only about triumph, it was built on the bodies of people the system never acknowledged. That state-kept myth hid political secrets. The next one hid secrets of nature, and it concerns the greatest disappearance in Earth's history. Myth number 29. Dinosaurs were killed only by an asteroid. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across struck the Yucatan Peninsula. The blast, comparable to billions of atomic bombs, brought darkness, cold, and mass extinctions. Dinosaurs vanished. It is a neat, elegant, persuasive narrative, supported by the real Chicxulub crater, but it is not the whole story. At the time of the impact, dinosaurs were already under stress. The Deccan volcanic province in India had been erupting vast volumes of lava and volcanic gases, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, for several 100,000 years. The climate was changing even without the asteroid. Dinosaur biodiversity had been declining long before the fatal strike. Contemporary research suggests the asteroid may have only hastened and completed a process already set in motion by volcanism. Some scientists argue that absent the asteroid, dinosaurs might have survived the volcanic interval, more slowly and with greater difficulty, but survived. Others maintain the asteroid was the decisive factor. The debate continues. What is certain is that some dinosaurs endured. Birds, direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs, survived to the present day. Strictly speaking, dinosaurs did not disappear entirely. They sing outside your window each morning. The myth of an instant apocalypse from a single hit simplifies a biologically complex, multi-factor process. Extinction is not a single event. It is an era. This myth searched for a single cause where there were many. The final myth of our anthology concerns the origins of the most human of misconceptions. Myth number 30. People are naturally selfish and made for war, the war of all against all. Hobbes. Man is a wolf to man. We are cruel by nature. Altruism is a thin civilizational varnish that flakes off at the first pressure. History is a chronicle of violence. Progress is a thin film over an abyss. This belief about human nature is among the oldest and most persistent, and among the most thoroughly challenged. Anthropological studies of recent decades have overturned the picture. Analysis of hunter-gatherer societies, the closest analogues to the conditions in which most of human history unfolded, shows that intergroup violence existed, but was far less systematic than assumed. Finds of skeletons bearing violence-related injuries in Paleolithic burials do occur, but far less frequently than in burials from early agricultural societies. Research into human behavior under extreme circumstances, disasters, floods, wars, repeatedly contradicts the claim that the civilizational varnish instantly peels away. Sociologist Rebecca Solnit, in her work on disasters, documented a phenomenon. In most catastrophes, people by default help one another. Looting and violence are the exception that makes headlines. Mutual aid is the norm that goes unnoticed. Evolutionary biology corroborates this. Cooperation was as powerful a survival mechanism as competition,